As Gregor Samsa awoke one morning from uneasy dreams, he found himself transformed in his bed into a giant insect. So begins Kafka's Metamorphosis. It is the story of a man who by some unknown magical means has overnight been transformed into a monstrous insect, the sight of which repulses everyone around him. It follows how he copes with the change, how his family treat him, and ultimately shows some of the ugliest sides of humanity I've ever read in a book. Through Kafka's novel, we will learn about the effects of fear on the human psyche, how dehumanization can break a mind, and how all of us can be more cruel and destructive than we realize. But first, let's set the scene. The novel follows four main characters. There is Gregor, the travelling salesman who unfortunately is now a dung beetle. His sister, Greta, a fundamentally kind person whose personality is eventually warped into something much crueler and less caring. Gregor's father, who is deeply fearful of Gregor and wants to ensure that he remains shut away where the world cannot see him. And Gregor's mother, who wants to care for him, but is so broken by the whole ordeal that she's mainly found weeping in a corner. A cheerful cast for a cheerful book. So, without further ado, let's get started. 1. The danger of fear. The Austrian founder of psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud, once theorized that if repressed or left unmanaged, fear can quickly morph into anger. And this is still held by therapists to this day. Think about it. If you are fearful, you're detecting a threat and you want to run away from it. This is the flight part of the fight or flight response. If it is clear that you cannot run, then the only option left is to fight. And the fear must transform into anger if it's to be any use to you. And this is exactly how Kafka demonstrates the disastrous effects that fear can have on the mind. Gregor fondly remembers how his family behaved to him before his transformation. He was the sole breadwinner of the household, and he says this granted him a place of respect in the family. His father and mother were proud of him. His sister admired him. He was loved, adored, and respected. But all of this changed with the simple application of fear. At first, there is the simple fear from his family that he can no longer work. He can no longer bring them income. As a result, they would each have to find their own employment, which was a frightening prospect for each of them. And there is a far more profound fear lurking just below the surface. They were scared of the sight of Gregor. This was not just because of his repulsive appearance, but more importantly, what he represented. He was the form of someone that they loved, twisted in such a way that he was totally unrecognizable. Perhaps it was also the suddenness of his transformation that terrified them. He was a reminder that life can fall apart at any moment, with no warning and no way of going back to the way things were. Whatever the original course of the fear, it quickly morphs into a destructive whirlwind of anger and hatred. First, they do not even do Gregor the dignity of looking at him. They isolate him in his room, with only his sister occasionally cleaning it and bringing him some odd scrap of food that had been left out. He is kept in his room by means of violence, if necessary, with his father beating him back there with a stick if he dares try to escape. In one pivotal scene, Gregor's father becomes so enraged at his presence that he throws an apple at Gregor, which lodges itself in his back. This is the wound that will eventually become infected and kill Gregor. So potent is the father's fear and rage that he murders his own son. And after Gregor is dead, the family breathes a sigh of relief as the source of their fear has vanished. After a brief mourning period, they rejoice that the beetle is gone from their lives, and they scurry off to another place, moving on to greener pastures. Kafka here does a wonderful job of showing us a truly ugly part of human nature. Often the things we fear, and thus strike out against, have not done anything wrong. We generally fear things because they are unfamiliar to us and threaten us in some way, whether that is intentional or not. Gregor's father fears Gregor because if anyone were to see the beetle, they would think of the family as unclean. But that's hardly Gregor's fault. Nonetheless, the fear did turn to anger and hate in the father's mind. And the exact same thing can happen to us. I don't think Kafka is being so simplistic as to say that fear and anger are always bad. After all, if somebody is trying to attack you in the street, then fear and anger are perfectly appropriate responses. But he does warn us that neither fear nor anger need be rational. And we should be aware of the effects they can have, both on those around us and on ourselves. But what of Gregor's own feelings? Well, that is what we shall move on to next. If you want more on philosophy and the art of learning, subscribe to my email list. The link is in the description. 2. Societal roles and pride. I once knew someone who desperately wanted to become a dancer. He worked incredibly hard on it, and there was no doubt that he was on his way to becoming a star. But then one day, in a freak car accident, he broke both his legs. While they would heal, he would never have the same sort of mobility that he used to, and his budding dance career was over. Robbed of this dream, he fell into a deep depression that took him a very long time time to get out of. He only managed it when he found a new identity that was just as strong as his old one as a dancer. He is now a physicist, and he takes just as much joy in that as he ever did in the stage. The point is that deprived of the thing that he hung his identity upon, he became miserable, and he found a way out of that with a brand new identity. And I think we can all relate to this sort of experience. We all have certain pillars upon which we build our sense of self. We might take great pride in how loving or caring we are, or the depths of our empathy. Mike Tyson said he used to take great pride in the fact that he could beat almost anyone in a fight. The point is that when these things are taken away from us, it is no wonder that this causes us great psychological harm. And no one illustrates this point better than Kafka. After his transformation, Gregor's mind is filled with anxiety about his identity. He is no longer able to provide for his family. He cannot work. He doesn't even appear human anymore. What was once his favourite food is now repulsive to him, while rotten vegetables somehow taste delicious. It is no wonder that he feels so miserable when everything he defined himself by has been taken away. And I want to focus on this role he has in providing for his family, because I think it helps demonstrate the double-edged sword of the roles we think we should play. On the one hand, the social role has worked very well for him so far. When he was able to provide, he felt immense joy and fulfillment. And since this role was also supported by his family, he had immense respect from them. But now he can no longer provide, no longer fulfill the role he and others think he should have. He falls into a profound type of despair. Schopenhauer says that since humans have the ability to think and reflect, they have the ability to multiply their joys and their losses by assigning themselves things that they must achieve. When they achieve their goal, they feel an immediate sense of joy, which then quickly fades as another goal takes its place. But when we do not live up to our expected accomplishments, this can plunge us into a deep despair. Schopenhauer uses this to take a somewhat pessimistic view on the human condition, but I am a little bit more optimistic than that. People find it very difficult to live without having something to strive towards. This is partly what Camus meant when he wanted us to imagine Sisyphus happy. We naturally take meaning from the process of overcoming obstacles, conquering challenges, and achieving a goal, no matter how big or small that goal is, fully recognizing that this challenge will soon be replaced by another one. But what happens when we have goals that are just out of our reach? Or we have goals assigned to us by others that we simply have no interest in? Or there are roles we have which are difficult to get out of if our circumstances change, and others will judge us if we even try to. I don't pretend to have the answers here, but existential philosophy offers us many avenues of thought that we could pursue. We could be like Sartre and argue that an authentic life where we refuse to play any role that does not suit us is the best route to fulfillment. We could be like Nietzsche and try to forge new values for ourselves, standing apart from the rest of humanity and strengthening our will to power. We could be like Camus and think we must move past the question of meaning altogether. Personally, I largely think the path is individual. I don't think that existential philosophy should be a command given by a general, but rather a gentle suggestion from a kindly old friend. But no one quite brings these existential questions of meaning and role to life, quite like Kafka. And that's probably why his books still echo in our ears today. But the delicate way Kafka charts the progression of Gregor's misery is its own work of genius. And that is what I want to move on to next. 3. Gregor's despair. We have all known despair in our lives, that creeping feeling that our existences have become unpleasant and malformed, that we no longer have access to the hope that sustains our joy, that we have been abandoned and rejected by those around us, with no hope of being loved or cherished again. And the character of Gregor himself is a wonderful case study into such a terrible mental state. As I mentioned in the previous section, his initial reaction to his transformation is that of mourning his old life. He longs for the days where he was a human being who could sustain himself, provide for his family, and interact with other people as his peers. But it is interesting to see just how his despair changes throughout the book. At first, while he is miserable and anxious, he still shows a profound care for his family, notably his sister. When he realizes she finds him disgusting to look at and is scared in his presence, he hides under the sofa while she is around. Despite it all, he still has a love in his heart for his family and his fellow man. But as he sinks deeper and deeper into despair, and as his family's attitude towards him does not shift, his outlook changes. Whereas before he had fooled himself into thinking that his loved ones were just getting over the shock of his transformation, and he would soon be welcomed back into the fold with open arms, now he is disabused of any such notion, and he reacts with understandable spitefulness. Instead of hiding himself away, he becomes rebellious. He climbs up onto the wall to frighten his sister and mother, because he wants to reassert himself into their world. He wants to say, "I am here, acknowledge me." He wants what we all want from our loved ones, which is for them to notice us and respect us as equals. This reaches a climax when he escapes the room that he's been locked in and scuttles around the kitchen. This is the point where his father finds him and throws the apple that will eventually kill him. From Gregor's perspective, he has gone from being ignored and abandoned to being outright hated, and this is what prompts the final stage of his despair. Eventually, Gregor just gives up. His spirit has been broken and he sinks fully into the depths of his mind. This is where he loses the will to live entirely. He stops eating, he stops moving almost altogether, and he seems to just be waiting to die. He aches all over from his father's abuse, and he longs for the day when the pain will go away, when he will be allowed to slip peacefully from this world into the arms of oblivion. And there is a huge amount of wisdom to be gleaned from Gregor's journey here. It is a fantastic analysis of how the process of social abandonment and hostility can cause people both to rebel and eventually to despair. We see this all the time in the actual world. How many people do you know who are filled with spite and hatred because of how they perceive that others have treated them? Kierkegaard talks of a kind of person who is so completely consumed by their own despair and misery that they lash out at the world itself and hate everything in it for how filled with suffering their life has become. This is the second stage of Gregor's pain, his fury and his indignation. And when the fury has all been expelled, when someone has tried everything to get others to notice and acknowledge them and none of it has worked, that is when they cannot do anything but sink deeper and deeper into their sadness. So perhaps we should be very conscious of just how painful abandonment can be, and we should ensure we are very careful about abandoning people in our own lives. But there is one pervading force that colours the entire book, and I simply cannot let it go unexamined. Shame. Think back to a time where you did something really embarrassing, when your cheeks flushed red and you felt the eyes of the world upon you. I remember once, a few years ago, I was in a social situation and I made a rather juvenile "your mum" joke at an acquaintance. I had completely forgotten that their mother had actually passed away earlier that year. As it happens, he was not in the least offended or upset, but I distinctly remember the shame I felt at having been so thoughtless. It is still one of those moments that my brain sadistically conjures up in my mind's eye as I'm trying to get to sleep, and the memory of the shame I felt is burnt into my psyche. I'm sure there are many times in your life where you felt similarly. It is almost a universal experience of being human, and no one brings this out quite like Kafka. The whole of Metamorphosis is dominated by the shame of the characters. There is Gregor's shame at not being able to provide, at his disgusting appearance and how he makes his family feel. There is the father's shame at having to take up a servant position in a bank, and how this makes him all the more willing to use force to control his cursed son. There is the mother's shame at not being able to look upon her darling boy anymore, at being terrified of the sight of her own offspring. There is the shame of the family as a whole that, deprived of Gregor's income, they've had to take 3 lodgers into their home, who talk down to them in their own living room. The entire cast of the novel feels a deep shame at almost every aspect of their existence. And in highlighting this, Kafka makes a devastating critique of how the individual rubs up against society, and the dark side of this interaction. The philosopher Thomas Hobbes wrote in his landmark text Leviathan that he thought human beings surrendered their freedom and agreed to take up certain roles in order to reap all the benefits of living in a peaceful society. So you give up the ability to do whatever you want, you agree to pay taxes and so on, and in return society promises that order will be maintained and no one will break into your house and kill you. Or at the very least, it promises to do its very best to stop this from happening. But many thinkers have criticised this picture. After all, we often did not explicitly agree to our societal obligations, and sometimes they appear more imposed from the outside than achieved by mutual consent. Nietzsche famously argued that social obligations kept exceptional or unusual people from achieving great things. And Kafka brings out one method that society uses to enforce its values upon us: the application of shame. Shame is almost like the internalized gaze of the values of whatever culture you happen to live in. So if you lived in a theocracy, you would feel shame over any religious doubts you have. And if you lived in a culture that really valued long hair, then you'd feel a deep shame at going bald. But Kafka's novel brings out just how destructive all of this shaming can be. The source of the family's shame is Gregor's transformation, and it is this shame, coupled with the fear that I mentioned earlier, that causes them to ignore, ostracize, and abuse Gregor, and eventually means that they celebrate his death. Kafka, through his writings here and his other works, like The Trial, explores how shame is neither an inherently moral nor immoral force. It is a completely amoral tool that can be used for extreme good or extreme evil, depending on the society and who is wielding the force of shame. So, characteristically of Kafka, he gives us a stark warning. Be wary of shame. Be wary of feeling ashamed. And most of all, be wary of how you shame others. You never know how this shame will impact them, or what horrible deeds they will do to be free of it. And if you want more on Kafka, check out this video where I talk about The Trial. And stick around for more on thinking to improve your life.